Today's Shir, we are going to be learning Siman Pei Zayin Sif Dalet. Continuing on with the sugya that we talked about in the last Shir and the topic of Marasayin. Says the Shulchan Aruch, Osir levashel b'chol avisha. It is prohibited to cook meat in the milk of a female, mifnei marasayin, because the milk of a female looks like regular milk, even though inherently it's not. So there's no actual isser of basar v'chalav with human female milk, but it is nonetheless osir to cook in the milk of a woman, to cook meat in the milk of a woman, mifnei marasayin, because it looks like basar v'chalav. The imnafal l'soichat tavshel, and if the milk of a woman would fall into a dish, let's say of meat, Batul v'ein tzarich shir. It would be totally nullified, and you don't need a shear. You don't need a shear like in general. We're going to learn about in many different areas in Isser v'heter. The shear to nullify an Isser is to have 60 against it. So you don't need a shear to nullify, because the whole concept of Marasayin is, does it look like you're doing an Isser? So if the milk or the Isser gets dissolved, not an Isser. I'm saying, let's say the milk, that the issue is Marasayin, how it looks. If you can't see it, it's not something you can see. It's not something that people would get confused about. No problem. It doesn't need 60. It just needs that it's not recognizable anymore. It just gets totally dissolved into the mixture that it falls into. So you don't need the regular shear that you have in olive. Now, the Ramah makes a point here that we're going to see is based off of a big question that the Ramah says. The Ramah says like this: V'nira lefiza, based off this Shulchan Aruch, the kolshkein the osir levashel lechatchila b'cholav tameya oy basar tamei b'cholav tar. Says the Ramah, based off this din of Marasayin, right? Based off this din that we have Marasayin by the milk of a female with milk. The same thing, it would also be Marasayin to cook, let's say, milk with a non-kosher piece of meat. We discussed earlier in Sif Gimel that cooking non-kosher meat with kosher milk or vice versa, there's no problem with basar v'chalav to cook it together. There's no issue, right? Of basar tamei, there's no issue. But there would be, says the Ramah, there should be an issue of Marasayin, because it looks like you're cooking kosher meat and kosher milk together, which is an Isser Torah. So, says the Ramah, that based off of this din of Marasayin, that din that we talked about in the previous sif should also be a problem to do. Okay. Now, it's a little bit interesting, the lashon of the Ramah here. The lashon of the Ramah is that it's a kolshkin, like if it's Marasayin in the case of female milk with kosher meat, so for sure if it's non-kosher meat and kosher milk, for sure there's Marasayin there. Why for sure? Just say who adin. So the Badei HaShulchan explains. He says like this: the milk of a woman is not a common thing. It's not a common thing. It's a very uncommon thing that somebody should be cooking or having, meat with milk of a woman. And right, and if we're geyser by something that's not common, for sure we should be geyser by something that may be more common, like non-kosher milk with kosher meat. That might be more of a common thing that somebody would do. It's something that's more realistic that somebody would do. It's not normal that people are eating the milk of a female. That is the way the Badei HaShulchan explains what the kol shekain is in the Ramah. And to continue on, the Ramah says, "V'davka basar behema." This is true by basar behema. Avo ba'oif derabanan, but by chicken, which is the din derabanan, ein lachash. There's l'chayra no issue. So he's saying, again, it sounds like the Ramah is repeating his din. Yeah, sounds like he's repeating his din about that Marasayin does not apply to Derabanans. Okay, so that is the Mechaber. That's the Ramah. Let's take a look at the Taz over here. Says the Taz. V'niru lefiza. B'darkei Moshe hishur divrei haraj be'elu. The Darkei Moshe, which is the Ramah's Sefer on the tour, the Darkei Moshe already asks on this Rajba B'chol Visha. The source of the din of the Shulchan Aruch by the milk of a female, the din of Marasayan is in the Shilas Teshuvas Rajba. And the Ramah says, I don't understand the Rajba. B'tzarachin, he says, I don't understand. Why is it different? Why is chol of tamei non-kosher milk with kosher meat? The mutter b'bishul. Why is that permissible with bishul? But the milk of a woman with kosher meat, with regular meat, is a problem with marasayin. Why don't we say it in both cases? Okay. He says the Rashba is very shver. The habateris abayis kasav Rashba behedjid v'chol of tamei mutter b'bishul. Non-kosher meat, milk, is mutter b'bishul b'hana. V'loy zocher shum isur marasayin. And yet the Rashba doesn't mention that there should be any issue of marasayin there, but he does say by the milk of a female. That is the kasha of the Darkei Moshe. And you see clearly that he held the kasha so strongly that in his Sefer Ramah, in his Piskei Halacha, he paskins 100% that in a chanami there would be marasayin in both circumstances. But says the Taz, I hold that the kasha that the Ramah is really bothered by is not a kasha. V'nirulani is daiti de einze kal v'chaymer. Says the Taz, I say it's not a kal v'chaymer. It shouldn't necessarily follow that this would be the case by non-kosher meat. The loy gazur mishum marasayin, the whole gzeira of marasayin is elabamidi de kosher lachila kolecha luchudos daima lebasar tar v'chol tar. Mishamachi bebishul imchol shkedim tzarich laniich shom shkedim l'chatchila. He says we only have a gzeira of marasayin by something that is mutter in and of itself. Because something that's not mutter in and of itself, they never made it. They never made the din of marasayin. B'chol visha shegam came mutter kol shapir shmenu k'mash kosav siman pei halav. Chol visha is mutter. Al kain also lavashal and basar mishum marasayin. Therefore it's a problem. Mashen came be machol tamei or basar tamei ain daima lebasar v'chol shotarm. It's not similar to basar v'cholav. Ve'al karchu like gazru shabif b'fnei marasayin. Therefore they never made the gzeira of marasayin. Kain nirul anias daiti borer el she'ein biyadi lahak b'mashech merachma. So the Taz says, I would think to make this argument against the Ramah, but I don't want to be makel in something that the Ramah was machmir. The Ramah says that marasayin does apply by non-kosher meat and with kosher milk and vice versa, and I don't want to be makel against the Ramah. But what's the svar of the Taz? The svar of the Taz is like this. The Taz is saying, what's the issue of marasayin? The issue of marasayin is people are going to start they see you're doing something, and they're going to start thinking you're allowed to do it. But says the Taz, we're not going to say that by something that we're already distant from, because it's not kosher. If it's not kosher, then we anyways should have no shaykhs to this item. So therefore, they're not going to need to make a din of marasayin by something that they have no shaykhs to. That we have no shaykhs to. To understand the Taz Svar is a little bit hard to understand because people are going to think it. So people are going to think it. And in light of the previous Taz, that the previous Taz says, whenever we could the Efshalon Laskuni Misakninon, in the previous Taz, he says a Lashon, and anytime we could try to stop people from thinking problems about what you're doing, we should try to do that. Here too, it's kind of like it doesn't make sense what the Taz is saying. Lamais, at the end of the day, if people are going to think you're doing something wrong, or people could think you're doing something wrong, we should put an end to it. So it's not very interesting, the svara, what the svara of the Taz is. But Lamaisa, he does make it as a serious svara, but he doesn't argue against the Ramah at the end of the day. Okay. Then he says like this. However, Mikol Makom Poshit Be'enai. It is simple in my eyes. Delafiza kolshkein sheyesh lesser mifnei marasayin. There should be an issue of marasayin levashel basar of b'chalav, to cook chicken and milk. There should be an issue. Shegazu by rabbanon behedya iser basar b'chalav. The rabbis made a din of basar b'chalav by chicken and milk. Ulachat tana have be'emes Da'iraisa, according to one Tana, it's really even a Da'iraisa. V'chein mashma divrei darkei Moshe. The Basar oif b'chalav, the chicken and milk, is Gora tvei mitmei b'chalav, should be even worse. So here the Taz is saying that Lamaisa, by chicken and milk, we taka should say this Marasai. And in fact, in the previous Taz, he also says we should say by chicken and milk that you should try to do as much as you can. Now, v'loy kemasha kasa b'levush, not like the levush that says the bezem mutter b'fnei Marasai, and there's no problem. Mishum de minkari, because chicken everyone knows is chicken is everyone knows what it is. Okay, he says the vare matzinu lepam shenechta pe'inyan shalem deleminkar. First of all, it's very possible that chicken can be cut in a way that it's not recognizable. V'suda royla yoda l'chalik pein basar oif l'shel behema. A person won't know to make the difference between chicken and meat. V'amas plukti de tanai. It's really a machlekes tanai. So Lamaisa comes out. Taz says that Lamaisa, he argues again on the Ramah that Lamaisa, by chicken and milk, there is an issue of Marasai. Vesu, Marshal, Kasam, Perkal, Basar, Siman, and Basar, Basar, Ikal, Lemechash, Tvei. We should even be more concerned. Shalayitu, Laimer, Basar, Bechal, Shari, Karabiya, Siglili. You don't want opinions to say that chicken and milk is mutter like Rav Yossi Aglili. Ad Kam L'Shayna. So Lamaisa, again, Taz is bringing the Marshal. We talked about in the previous year that chicken and milk, Lamaisa, says the Taz, has an issue of Marasai. The language that the Ramah says, if you take a look at the Ramah's language, V'nira lefi zeh, the kolshkein de aser levashel lechatchila, b'chalav temeah. It is aser to cook initially lechatchila with non-kosher milk because of Marasai. Why does he say lashon of lechatchila? Marasayin is an Isser. So says the Taz, the language of lechatchila that the Ramah is mentioning, and we're going to see similar language by chal of mesa soon. Le'inyan bishul, nirish and eskaven, it seems that he's trying to intend to say, sheyesh l'zayir, you have to be careful, b'makom she'ein tzarich gadol. So in other words, the whole din of Marasayin is only if there's no great need. But if there's a need for a refuah, even though there's no danger, but it's a refuah, you can do it in that which the only Isra Achila is only Mirabanan. Okay, so if the issue is an issue of the Isra Achila is only midrabanan, okay, or it's a chal of Tamea case. So he says in that type of case, okay, in that type of circumstance, you could be makel if there's a need, if there's a makam tzarich for a refuah, for healing, medicinal thing. Even if it's not a sakana, you could be mata and marasayin. So in other words, the lashon lechatchila is not talking about like, oh, you could just do it whenever you want. But if there's a medicinal need, okay, a refuah need, then you can. That's the lashon that lechatchila is coming to tell you. Initially, you can't do it. You can't do it in a circumstance, in a normal circumstance. But if it's a refuah circumstance, you could. That's where we find heterim by dvarim of marasai. Okay. Let's continue on to the shach here. There's a very important shach here. Very, very important shach. Says the shach Zayin. V'nira lefi zeh de kolshkein. Lefi das harav, according to the Ramah, the kolshkeinu, that it's a kolshkein that we should say the din of marasai by non-kosher meat with kosher milk or vice versa. Nearer the tzarich liyashiv, you have to answer how the kosvu atur v'hamachar. You have to answer what the matur and the Shulchan Aruch write b'sif gimel mutar b'bishul hana. Over there in Sif Gimel it says it's permissible in bishul hana. It doesn't mention marsai. Mishnah Rucha per kol basar. It's a Mishnah in Chulin. Muskim mikol paiskim, and it's accepted by all paiskim. The hainu, that what it means is the mutar medina. that from strict Basar B'chol of Dinim, it's permissible. We're not talking about Marasayin. We didn't get into that. But in a Chanami, it is an issue of Marasayin. But the Shulchan Aruch is not talking about Marasayin. He's talking about Basar B'chol of it in issues. And it will make differences in circumstances where there's no issue of Marasayin. There are many circumstances that we don't care about, we're not bothered by Marasayin. And one of them is refuah. Marshal, Perikol, Basar Siman Kuf Beis, Gabi Chol, Vishad the refuah shari. Afil ein by sakana klal. Me'acher de ein by yisr klal mishum Marasayin. When the issue is Maras Ayin, it's what people are going to think. For medicinal things, it's not a problem, even if there's no sakana. That's number one. What the Shulchan Aruch, when the Shulchan Aruch is, leaves it blank. When is it mutter medina? There are circumstances where it won't come to Marasayin. So therefore, the Shulchan Aruch is able to leave it and just say it's mutter. What do you mean? It's never mutter. No, there are times where it could be mutter. Okay. There are other circumstances. Okay. It says, now we can answer, says the Shach, the Ramah's question. The Ramah asked the Grace Akasha, why does the Rashba say by Chol V'Isha there is Marsai, but by non-kosher milk and kosher meat there is no? He doesn't mention it. Third says, because there are circumstances that Marsai doesn't apply. Okay? There are circumstances that Marsai doesn't apply. However, divrei hapoiskim shekosvu stama mut. And by the way, and we're talking, and the Rashba was always, and the Rashba, when he talked about the case of non-kosher meat and kosher milk, was only talking about lakabi bas b'chal. It could be Marzayin, just could be Marzayin. We're not dealing with that. Achain says the Shach, though, I don't agree. Divrei hapoiskim shekosvu stama. The poiskim l'maisa say mutarim bebishul. Mashma da afilu mishum Marasayin. It's mashma that there's no Marasayin. And I guess you have to throw into the chalant. Oh, one second. This is what seems to be the Shulchan Aruch's opinion. He doesn't say that there's an issue of Marasayin. And I'll tell you why it's fair, because he literally says in Sif Daled an issue of Marasayin. One sif later, the Shulchan Aruch says there's a concept of Marasayin. So you mean to tell me he couldn't tell me it earlier? He should have said it earlier. He should have brought it already by, if he wants to introduce the concept of Marasayin, why didn't he introduce the concept of Marasayin in the previous halacha by non-kosher milk and meat? I think that's really the amkus of the question here in the Shach. He says, it's hard to say such a thing in the Shulchan Aruch. So therefore, based off this, the Shach says a big chiddush in the klal of Marasayin. L'kach nirali bar. It seems to me clear. The shiny hasam over there, it's different. Kivan da kopanim echad mehem aser ba'achila. Since one of them is also in eating, devadai bebishul chudei leka mishum Marasayin. When it comes to cooking, if your issue is cooking, there is no Marasayin. Because it could be that he is cooking it for a refuah, for a medicinal thing. He's not cooking it to eat normally. He's cooking it for a medicinal thing. You don't know why he's cooking it. You don't know the intention. When you see a guy eat, you know why he's eating it. But when you see a guy cook, you don't know. Maybe he's cooking it for a refuah, or other purposes that would be permissible. So therefore, the Shach says there is never a din of Maris Ayin by cooking. And we're going to see in the Shulchan Aruch the lashon is asur levashal. In the Ramah's lashon it's the asur levashal. But asur levashal. Do you know what it means? Hainu lechol. It means to eat. Doesn't mean to cook. Chen mashkos of mechar b'sifei also levashlam does not mean al karchuch tzarich nami lefarshay. You have to explain it la'achal. Can't eat it. Cooking it, you could do. It's not an issue of marasai. We find this in Psukim, Mishnah. That the Torah says eating in a language of Bishul. Ayin Shah. And in that circumstance, then there's a problem with Marsai. So unbelievable Chiddush, he says. There is no issue of Maris Ayin by cooking. There's only an issue of Maris Ayin by Achila. Okay? And therefore, when our Shulchan Aruch says, also lavash b'chol visha, you can't eat meat and chol visha. Bishul, there's no. And you're going to tell me, he said in by the non-kosher stuff that it's, well, anyways, it's not, you're not allowed to eat it because it's not kosher. So there's no, and cooking, there's no problem with Mars by cooking. Now, you have to say this even for the Shita of the Ramah. Because even if you have kosher meat and almond milk, you only have to do it, you only have to put almonds next to it unless you're cooking it together, because otherwise it's only drabbanan. So you can have the kasha like this. You can ask kasha like this. The only way for the previous Ramah, the only way for there to be an issue of marasayin, okay, by meat and almond milk, is if it's cooked already. That's the only way it could be a daraisa that marasayin applies on it. In fact, one second. How are you allowed to cook it to begin with? How are you allowed to go cook it? Shouldn't there be a problem with marasayin? How are you able to cook it from day one? Right? How are you able to do that? So what are you gonna? So he says, it's a big daichik to say the b'shas bishul when you cooked it. When you cooked it, you put the almonds next to it. You know why it's a big daichik? Because if you have almonds for the cooking, why can't you have almonds for the eating? Right? And LMI, we're telling you need to have almonds. Well, you already have almonds. So it's a big daichik to say that. Elavare must be. Cooking, there's no marasayin. Cooking in and of itself, there's no issue of marasayin. Because you're cooking it for a medicinal purpose. The hilkach hoda osur lavashel basar b'chol visha. When it says you're not allowed to cook meat with female milk, hainu lecha means to eat. Hilkach basar behemoth tamei b'chol tahira yibcha kivad al koch lav la'achla mevashlu. You're not cooking it to eat it. The ha'akol panam asurim mishum basar b'chol chol tamei. Lecha mishum marasayin. There's no issue over there marasayin. Why are you cooking it? Clearly not to eat, because it's anyways also to eat. So there's no issue of marasayin. This is how we can explain the Rashba. Because very simple. The kasha is not a kasha b'chlal. There's no marasayin by cooking. So what's the kasha? Elamai. So by non-kosher meat and kosher milk, what are you going to say? By the achila, there should be marasayin. It's anyways also to eat. Inami basar tamei. So he says, no, I'll tell you another teretz. Inami basar tamei. Tell you another teretz to the problem. To this whole kasha of female milk versus non-kosher meat and kosher milk. Non-kosher meat, like there's no issue with marsayin. Did nikr la'ain shu basar because it's easily recognizable that it's not kosher meat. V'chein chalav tameya k'is b'shas b'aved zara. Says non-kosher milk also. The Gemara says chalav tar is chiver. Kosher milk is white. Tameh is yarek. It has a little bit of a green look. So there's no marsayin. But female milk and milk of almonds is not recognizable. So you can answer the Rashba with that. Says the Shachla at the end of the day, I like the first teretz. And the first teretz says a big yesod in Maris Ayin. There is no Maris Ayin by Bishul, according to the Shach. Now, on this, Lamaisa, the Achronim argue on this. Take a look at the Pri Megadim and the Pri Chodosh, and it's even mashma like this in the Taz, that the Taz that they explain that the Ramah holds that there is Lamaisa Marasayin by Bishul. They are chaylik. They say that there is Marasayin by Bishul against the Shach. So it does seem to be a chaluke deis in the Paiskim. Happens to be, I saw in the Bari Shulchan, I think that he's machmir. But yeah, I wanted to see how the Taz is mashma that. Taz is mashma that. I guess we'll do it for another time because it's a complicated arichas in the Pri Megadim over here. But Maisa, the Pri Megadim does say, the Pri Megadim says that the pashtus of the Ramah is not like the way the Shach is learning it. Even though the Shach says his teretz, the Shach says that it has to be that there's no Marasayin by Bishul according to the Ramah. It's debatable amongst the Achronim if that is the right, correct shot in the Ramah. And therefore, many Achronim are machmir by Marasayin by Bishul. To finish off here, the Shach says in Sifkot and Ches, he's going according to Shita B'Sif Gimel, right? That by chicken and milk, there's no Marasayin. The Ramah is going according to Shita. Right? Even by chicken, there's a problem. That's why the Rashba and the Mechaber don't make a distinction between animals and chickens, and l'chayra there would be Marasayin even as well. So the Shach, again, that's the debate that we had in the previous year between the Ramah and the Shach, whether or not we say Marasayin by Isurei D'Rabbanan. That is the main points over here for Sif Dalet.